Have you ever thought about your raise first in strategy and the difference between GTO and actual poker games? Do you have any idea what the most likely outcomes are when you raise first in from early position at low stakes, and how to adjust your preflop range correctly based on the population tendencies? Well, today I will give you an insight in this. My name is Luke, and this is a new episode on the Crushing Small Stakes PLO course. What is it that you will learn today? First of all, we're going to look at the fold equity from early position that we have when we open raise and compare GTO versus the population tendencies. We will then move on to why the fold equity is actually so low in the games that we're playing. We will see how to adjust your preflop range, and we will specifically look into low EV open raises and hands that are interesting candidates to fold that are on open in the GTO setting. But first things first. Let's look at fold equity from early position at PLO 50. If we compare GTO versus the population tendencies, we will actually see completely different outcomes. In a GTO setting, when early position opens, he will have 51% fold equity. In other words, if he raises from early position, 51% of the time he will win the pot preflop. In the upcoming two slides, I will tell you why this number is actually so high. But first, let's look into population tendencies and what the number is in the games that we are playing. Take a moment and think about it. What is your estimation here? Or maybe you have an actual accurate number here in your head. Take a second. The number here is actually 8%. Think about this. 8% of the time when you raise from early position at low stakes PLO, you will win the pot preflop. The other 92% of the time, you're guaranteed to play a pot. Either heads up, multi-way, or you get 3-bet. Now you can already see that the numbers here are vastly different. And this must have an impact on our preflop hand selection. More about that in a moment. Let's look at raise first in and the outcomes first in the actual games that we are playing. If we raise from early position, we will win the hand preflop by getting 5 folds from our opponents 8.2% of the time actually. Obviously this number can be different based on your own database or based on your research, but this is a good average number here. We see a flop heads up in a single raise pot 24.6% of the time. We see a pot multi-way single raise pot 45.2% of the time. So almost half the time, if we raise, we will end up at least 3-way on the flop in a single raise pot. Now the remaining 22% of the time we get 3-bet, which will add up to a total of 100%. So you can see here that the dynamic and the population tendencies actually have a big impact on the strategy that we should apply when we raise first in, because we don't have that much fold equity. And let's jump into that. Why is it that we don't have as much fold equity? Let's move on to the next slide. One of the main reasons is that cold calling numbers comparing GTO versus the actual population are completely different. In a GTO setting, the cold calling numbers are very tight and very strict and very well constructed. The main reason here, or one of the biggest reasons here, is because the GTO setting will think a lot about the rake influence of the game. In other words, at low stakes, the rake is very high, and therefore we don't want to enter too many pots in a passive way where we don't have any fold equity preflop, because we are guaranteed to pay that rake. However, in reality, that's completely different. People don't think like that. People don't take away all those considerations. They will look at their hand and about their opponents, and they make a decision. And you can already see here the massive difference. Let's look at MP versus early position raise. In a GTO setting, the MP player will call 3.7% of the time. But in reality, on average, it's around 10.5% of the time. Let's look at the other numbers. Cutoff versus early position. 5.7 in a GTO setting versus 12.9. Almost more than 2%, more than twice as many hands are calling there. Button versus early position. 9.6 versus 16.4. Small blind versus early position. I mean, that's the biggest difference from all. You don't want a cold call from small blind that many hands at all. If you look at the GTO numbers here, 1%, basically zero, almost zero. But in reality, people still call the same group of hands here. 13.9% of the time there's a cold call from small blind facing an RFI from early position. And lastly, the big blind, we already touched on that last week as well. It's 14% in the GTO setting, but in reality it's around 31%. So these numbers are completely different. And that means that in a GTO setting, if you raise from early position, you face way less cold calls, and therefore you have much more fold equity. In a population tendencies, like in the real games that we're playing, you can see very high cold calling numbers, and therefore much more pots that we have to play. Much more often we have to pay that rake. Much more often we will end up in multi-way pots. Completely different situations, and we have to adjust our preflop range based on these outcomes. We cannot expect the same hands have the same EVs basically in these situations. Now, what is it that we should actually consider when we raise from early position? There are a few important elements here before we are jumping into some hand examples to illustrate you what hands might probably be better off folding instead of open raising. First of all, you want to calibrate your range and the hands that you raise with for multi-way pots, because it's so likely to play a multi-way pot. You already saw that. Like 45% of the time if you raise, you play a multi-way single raise pot. That doesn't even take into consideration a potential 3-bet pot in a multi-way scenario. When it comes to multi-way pots, you obviously want to think about a few elements that you might have heard before already, or that you might have that are familiar to you maybe, like nuttiness, connectivity, and playability. And probably a mix of more than one of these, because in multi-way pots, you want to have a lot of potential going to the flop. You don't want to check fold too many hands. If you are the pre-flop aggressor, you want to be able to bet certain boards. You don't want to play too passively there all the time. There are a lot of reasons and arguments that these components in your hand are important to think about when you raise first in. Secondly, think about low EV opens are often best to fold. Now we will get there in a moment when we look into hand examples. But in a GTO setting, some of the hands that we should open raise are very, very, very low EV open raises. And based on my experience and my research and the intuition and ideas that we have about the game, like these very low EV open raises, they shouldn't be open raised in reality if there are so many multi-way pots, if fold equity is so low. Even if these players enter the pot with like a wide range, that doesn't mean that we should become much wider or that we should open raise all these hands, because we are still guaranteed to pay the rake, to play a lot of multi-way pots, and to get into a lot of post-flop problems, because we are no computers. We don't play perfect PLO post-flop. We are learning the game, and we should get used to the fact that all starts with playing a strong and selective pre-flop RFI strategy from early position that will help us a lot post-flop as well. And thirdly, also very important, when you open raise from early position, the ace in your hand is always a very powerful component, because it is blocking 3-betting ranges and it generates a little bit more fold equity. So especially if you have an ace with the ace-high suit and with like 3 side cards that are well connected, or with Broadway cards in addition, an ace with double suitedness and connectivity, like those components are very powerful, and those hands are often make up for a good raise. So remember these 3 elements, think about them, maybe take a screenshot about them, but this is very important to consider when you raise first in. Now let's look into some hand examples, and to make it more practical. First of all, we're going to look into the single suited rundowns here. In a GTO setting, we are raising rundowns with 0, 1 or 2 gaps that are single suited 25% of the time. We are raising single suited rundowns with at least 3 Broadway cards in them 41% of the time. I'm going to show you some hand examples here that are actually supposed to be opens in a GTO setting. King 10 9 8 with the king high suit. Jack 10 9 8 with the jack high suit. 8 7 6 5 single suited. Like these 3 hands, I'm very, very sure that most of you will open raise these 3 examples always from early position. And including myself. I mean, Jack 10 9 8 single suited, that's not a standard fold at all for me. These hands are actually very, very, very marginal. And the reason, first of all, is the EV. If you look at these 3 examples, the EV of these individual hands is 0.05 big blind. In other words, if you play 100 of these hands from early position, you will only make up 5 big blind per 100. Now, if you look at an average win rate for early position, you will see very often numbers around 10 to 20 big blinds per 100 hands talking about win rates from early position. So you can already see that these hands are much lower than the average win rate that we have from early position. In addition to that, these hands are anyway very low EV opens. We have seen that in the solver outcomes. So if we then compare those solver outcomes with the population tendencies in the actual games that we're playing, you should highly consider folding these hands, because these hands don't do that well in multi-way pots. They have low suits, they can have marginal playability post-flop, and they just don't do that well because the EV is very low and the playability post-flop isn't great. Jack high suit, 8 high suits, if you will end up like 3-4 way, those hands cannot call multiple streets a bet. Those hands cannot start c-betting themselves. They can't apply pressure. They should play very passively, and therefore it's quite difficult to make any money with them, especially from early position if you have 5 players left to act. So think about these hands. These are good examples of hands that are candidates to start folding from now on because the EV is so low, and the post-flop and the population tendencies have a huge impact on that. Let's look at some more examples. Double suited rundowns. In a GTO setting, double suited rundowns with 0, 1 or 2 gap, open raising 75% of the time. I mean, those are beautiful hands in general. They look very appealing there. They have a lot of playability, and often when they are good connected, they are good open raises. 3 Broadway cards, double suited, 83% of the time, and 2 Broadway and 2 low cards, 47% of the time. Let me give you some examples of the low EV hands in these categories. What about 10-8-7-5? Have you ever considered open raising this one from early position? 2 gappers lose a lot of EV when you open raise from early position. These hands can be up to 4 to 5 times weaker than the same components, the same type of hands when they only have 1 or 0 gap. There's a massive difference there, and the playability and EV should have a big impact on whether or not to open raise a hand like this. I would highly recommend to only open raise the medium and low rundowns when they are double suited with 0 gaps or 1 gap only, because if you have more than 2 or more gaps, the EV will drop so significantly that it's pretty difficult for you to come up with a positive win rate there with that hand, based on the population tendencies again. Ace-Jack 4-3. I mean, look at this hand. It's quite nice. There's some connectivity. You have an ace-high suit. You have a jack-high suit. But even a hand like this, you should be careful because you have 2 wheel cards. And wheel cards on average will significantly drop your EV and also don't add that much benefit post-flop. Obviously, sometimes you do need that connectivity to the wheel part of the board. But on average, you don't have that many strength with those specific cards, and they don't add that much to the playability post-flop. Like this is a good example of a hand that is very, very marginal, but most of you will probably open raise it. Let's look at another hand, Queen 10-7-6. Don't overvalue medium connectors that have multiple gaps in them. Like, I'm pretty sure that I would have opened this hand quite often here, and many of you will open that. But if you look at them, there are 3 gaps in there, the suits are low, and there are 5 players left to act. Like, the likelihood to end up in a multi-way pot with a 10 high suit on the flop, I mean, what are we going to do there? It's so difficult to make any money there. And in the GTO setting, we have so much more fold equity, these hands become slightly profitable. But if that is not the case, and we have to be guaranteed, and we are going to pay that rake very, very often, it's going to be quite hard to become a winner with these type of hands. Lastly, high pairs, another important category because they are often overplayed and overvalued. Broadway pairs double suited, 53%. I mean, the number is not even that high. I would expect many of you will think that this number would have been higher to open raise with. Broadway single suited pair, much weaker already and much less often played, 22% only raised from early position. Hands like King 9-5, double suited. Pretty sure a standard open for most of you. Queen 7-6 double, same story. King Jack 7 single suited. And what about Queen 10-9? Like, these hands all have a very, very, very marginal EV win rate. It is around 0.05 to 0.1 big blind, and that is very, very low for high pairs, especially with hands that don't do well multi-way. often you will end up with a marginal suit or with a bare overpair, and it's quite difficult to continue post-flop with hands that don't flop very smooth there. So as told you, these hands have around an EV of around 0.05 big blinds, something that was quite surprising to me, at least. They have very marginal playability. Multi-way pots, you already know about those kind of things. Like some are doing better, of course, some are doing worse, but on average they don't do very well. And thirdly, a very important element with high pairs is that the fold versus 3-bet number is very high. So if we get 3-bet, we are guaranteed with most of these hands that we should fold, because they match up so poorly against aces and they don't flop very smooth in 3-bet pots. We cannot stack off that often. So we should be very careful there. So to wrap this video up and to give some takeaways at the end, I mean, we've definitely seen some interesting elements here about the hands that we should be careful with, like low EV opens. We talked about what is going to happen when we raise first in from early position. We have to close it here and to get some understanding at the end about all the topics here that we've been talking about. First of all, what is important when you raise first in is to think about calibration. In other words, you should think about nuttiness, playability in multi-way pots, and blockers to 3-betting ranges. Because the likelihood of playing a flop is very high, and to play a multi-way pot is also very high, like we should calibrate our open raising hands toward hands that do well in these situations. The difference between GTO and population tendencies is so different there. We don't have a lot of fold equity here. So be careful there and make sure to think about it next time you sit in this situation. And secondly, expected value, in other words, the EV. Fold low EV opens. There's absolutely it doesn't matter at all if you start folding some of the very, very lowest EV opens. Those hands don't have any significant impact on your win rate, and very likely will actually be a losing play because of multiple factors. In the first play, they are actually low EV opens anyway. But if we then start playing a lot of multi-way pots, we are going to pay rake very often because we don't have a lot of fold equity. And post-flop, we are no computers. We don't play perfect PLO. We are making mistakes, and we should think already about that pre-flop. We don't want to get ourselves into too many difficult spots post-flop if that's unnecessary. So folding hands that have like a 5 big blind per 100 win rate or less, maybe 10. I mean, there's nothing wrong in doing that. It is a very smart way on approaching a situation where the win rate on average is the lowest for all situations. Like in early position, we don't have a high win rate anyway. So we want to be very selective with that many players behind us. And I see a lot of players making these mistakes day in, day out, including myself very often. And we should be much more selective with the hands that we play. We're not playing high stakes, we're not playing mid stakes, we're playing low stakes. And therefore we should be careful because the likelihood of playing multi-way pots is very, very high and the fold equity is very low. Now, I hope this video gave you some new information and some new insights about raising first in from early position, and that you get some cool takeaways from this. I put down a quiz below the video as well to test you on a few of these hand examples from early position. Interesting hands you should consider folding now. And I will also highly recommend you to pay attention to the bucket tool that we released in our Discord channel at the moment. In the very near future, we will connect our low stakes pre-flop ranges as well. And when that is the case, you will be able to actually start taking a lot of training for early position. Select specific win rates to the hands that you want to train for, and train those hands that are actually very, very marginal. That is something that will come very soon. I will keep you updated if that will happen. And until that moment, I wish you all the best by training your early position. Jump in there and get some ideas. And don't be afraid of folding the very, very marginal hands here. This was a new episode for the Crushing Small Stakes PLO course. I will see you next week. Over and out. Look for the PLO Mastermind.